everybody. It's Thursday, it's 2 p.m. Eastern, and that means it's another Bold Leaders and Learning episode. I'm delighted to have you here. I know we're all on pins and needles following the presidential election, but hopefully this will be a fantastic way to distract yourself from refreshing browsers and following Twitter updates. I'm delighted to have somebody who I now call a friend. I had a chance to meet earlier this year, Fernando Snowden-Lorence, who is the Vice President of Global Philanthropy at JP Morgan Chase. He and I met initially because we had an opportunity to sit at an event called The Table, where we talked about some of the challenges that veterans face in transitioning from military into civilian workforce. And Fernando happens to be a veteran of the Marine Corps, and a big part of his background. We're going to talk a little bit about that because that's an important subject that's important to both of us in terms of some of the work we've done. But Fernando, I want to take a step back. First of all, say thanks for joining. Would love to just have you describe a little bit about your own personal background, right? And then from there, a little bit about the rather extensive work that you're doing in your role as Vice President of Global Philanthropy. So please tell us a little bit more about you and the work that you're into right now.
Brandon, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And my journey starts in Brooklyn, in East New York. That's where I'm from, and I think it's actually informed a lot of my later career choices quite a bit. I didn't realize until after I had the opportunity to actually join the military. I joined the Marine Corps. I have a couple of service members in my family. In fact, both of the men I knew growing up were Vietnam veterans. And I think that had a significant impact on what I thought was possible and the direction I thought I was supposed to be going. And so, when high school was over and I was kind of attempting college, if you will, I'll talk about that a little bit more, and trying to figure out whether I could both afford it, whether the family could afford to have me just going to school and not kind of really making substantial income. I had younger siblings on their way to college as well. I decided, because I had role models in my family, that the military was a really good choice for me. Again, not necessarily for everyone, but for me, it was the right choice at the right time to be able to make money, to learn, to grow, to build skills across technological and management fields, interpersonal spaces. And I took the opportunity. I went. I'm extraordinarily proud of my time in the Marine Corps in particular. I'm very much proud Marine, and my best friends are still folks that I served with, both here in the States, in training, and overseas. I had 2 deployments in my early 20s while I was in the Marine Corps, and those were significant experiences as well. They both highlighted for me the value of what you do when you serve, but also I started to think about the needs as I started to get in my early to mid 20s of my immediate family. And I've got a lot of folks who I thought would depend on me as I got older, both for income and for support, kind of my physical presence, and decided I needed to transition out of the service. And I'd also been in for almost 10 years and felt like I was ready and thought I knew what I needed to know about transitioning out of the military, which is just that I needed to go. I trained, I had skills. In the service, you go to so many different schools. You do so many different workshops to learn everything by the numbers, if you will. So any kind of billet, any kind of job that you get. And I was actually in a technical field. I was a communications specialist in the Marine Corps. So I had actually been to a year-long school, 9 months, and then a few months after it, to learn my job, and thought, I know everything I need to know, and I'm ready to get out of the service. I'm ready to get out of uniform and be home. And I did not know everything I needed to know, as I've said a few times, and had to figure a lot out. I really had to get my head screwed on straight after I left the service, going back to school to finish my degree, which was really a primary focus that I had. And figure out what I was going to do, both with my military training, with a college degree, what kind of job was I going to find. And just to kind of give a little context to how I find myself here, I gravitated after the service to direct service jobs after serving in the military, to work in direct service, working with people. and I found myself with some opportunities in the nonprofit sector, and realized that I really thought that education, social services was a kind of a primary support for folks, and felt like this is what I want to do. This is how I'm going to impact, how I'm going to continue serving the public, continue serving my community. And I got bit, kind of by the bug, so to speak, when I worked in
Yeah.
that space. And I've been lucky to continue working in it, specializing in education, particularly for communities of color. I've volunteered a lot and even started a small organization, a nonprofit, with some friends that focused on mentoring young men of color. And that brings me to a great extent to where I am. I was really in a pool of individuals who had experience in the nonprofit sector. I'd been in a number of startups, a few startups in that space. So I had advocated, I'd learned the policy, I had worked in schools, and the firm was looking for individuals who had that experience. And so just one last anecdote about it is that I saw the opportunity. Someone presented it to me and said, your profile is right for this. You should put in for it. And I thought, I've never worked in corporate America. I've never worked in a corporate space. I have worked in the military, which means there's no bureaucracy too big for me at this point. I understand how those work. And then I looked at the opportunity. I did some research on the firm, and it's actually their jobs program that to a great extent convinced me to go in and apply and go through the application process, because they had then been engaged in the military jobs program, the 100,000 jobs program, which is now the million jobs program. And everything I read, everyone I spoke to said that this is very real, that they are engaged in the community, they're doing outreach, they're trying to reach veterans. And so I went in and I applied, and I lucked out. And here I am now, 5 years plus.
Well, it's an amazing background, and as you kind of described it when we were talking earlier, it was you described it as a winding pathway, and in some ways it is, right. But there were real themes there. I mean, your focus on service and community, and that has been consistent throughout, and in many ways, the role you're in now, right. Even though as you mentioned, you hadn't technically worked for a large corporation before, the role you're in really requires an understanding of all those various parts of your background. And I know we're gonna talk about that, right? Because the philanthropy that JP Morgan Chase is supporting is really, I mean, it's significant. It's both external facing and has a lot of ties to what's happening inside the organization. And so, want to start talking a little bit about that. Give us a sense of the major programs that you're sponsoring now and supporting. And I know we're going to kind of talk about several of those in a little bit more detail, but I think giving everybody just a sense of the major efforts that you have underway and the breadth of those efforts would be really helpful.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And we had a chance to touch a little bit on something that is a little bit newer, but also I think gives an example of direction that the firm is headed in. A program called Advancing Black Pathways, which is both an internal and external effort on behalf of JP Morgan Chase, where we are looking to promote internally people of color from entry-level positions to mid-management, all the way to senior management, and essentially create pipelines, promote pipelines, and build better kind of entry-level access points for people of color to the firm. We've been doing what I think over the last 5 to 10 years is a good job. It's now become a yeoman's effort internally, to where one of the primary goals, which will soon be attached to some really important assessments internally, will show how we're doing, and we're going to continue to promote that effort. Advancing Black Pathways also has an external component where we are doing community development work. We're partnering with nonprofits. We're doing a lot of work in terms of addressing the racial wealth gap and looking into what the causes are and addressing those, not just through resourcing nonprofits who may work with families and small business owners so that they're getting capital, they're getting training, but also looking at our own lending practices when it comes to small business loans, when it comes to things like home mortgages, and figuring out what issues do we need to address, where do we need to make an adjustment, and to put a finer point on it, making sure that there's a little bit more access for our customers and clients. Another program, as I mentioned earlier, is the work that we do around veterans. Something that drew me to the firm, the 100,000 jobs, 1 million jobs, which will very soon be the 10 million jobs program, continues to advance. It's more than 10 years old. We have 20 plus corporations directly engaged just in the Northeast alone. We continue to work in that space and to promote internally veterans, pulling them into the firm, pipelining them in. We do things to the point where we have specific efforts towards those who have college degrees, who've been potentially to service academies, those who do not, those who were enlisted in the service. We have internal mentoring programs in a lot of these spaces, including for veterans. And then I'll throw in, there are a lot of programs, just two more. Our Tech for Social Good program, which I mentioned earlier, is an entire team working specifically on STEM and for those positions inside of the firm for sourcing our technical and programming needs. So we have a number of programs that represent internal and external efforts, as well as partnerships, private and public partnerships, where we can develop pipelines both into the firm, but also support the field as well. The last one, the fellowship initiative, is one that I work on very directly, and that is a college and career readiness program for young men of color. And that's demographically specific because of some of what is lacking in terms of the graduation rates for young men of color from high school in this country. And then of course, how that ripples out towards college acquisition, persistence, or any sort of post-secondary acquisition and training if you're not getting that high school diploma. And in all these cases, there's both the ability to lift up the field in the sector through sourcing people and nonprofits that are doing good work, but also looking at what we can do internally to draw people to the firm and provide them with opportunities at JP Morgan. So that's just a few of those.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really incredible set of activities, and I've been familiar with some of them as I've kind of seen various bits and pieces, and probably updates I've seen you post on LinkedIn as well. But like I wasn't aware of all of that, and that's probably the challenge, right? Is in thinking about where do we put our time and energy and resources, right? How many different things can we invest in? But like one of the themes that clearly, there are several themes that I wanted to talk about. One is that I think traditionally people have this idea that corporate philanthropy was something where, a company did something, right? We were in banking or whatever the industry was. And then separately, we do some good for an organization that, is a nonprofit, and, they're not necessarily related to one or the other, right? And what you've described though, is that all these efforts are clearly geared towards very powerful social impact opportunity. But one of the things that's become a major component of it is the internal goals of a JP Morgan Chase trying to build a diversity talent pipeline, right? In terms of who it hires. And as you mentioned, all of these programs have opportunities for people to come through these programs and potentially end up with an internship at JP Morgan Chase or a job at JP Morgan Chase. And so it's interesting to think that there's an evolution in the corporate philanthropy and HR space where those things are like increasingly, similar initiatives. I'm curious if you feel that that's the sense, right? And how much does your role in kind of the global philanthropy perspective actually interface with the HR leadership at the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do feel that's where the primary innovation is coming. In that's not a traditional conversation. That's not where the HR function, a philanthropic function, a community development function, and certainly those folks who do that in a line of business. In an organization the size of ours, you have functional teams working in communities at a retail bank, in asset and wealth management, but now the need for customers and clients to understand, who are you as a corporate entity and what kind of work are you doing, has really pushed us to get together and share information, share best practices, talk about how we're impacting the communities that we're in, not just in silos, but as a group. And what you see because of that, I think, is a greater effort and a greater opportunity for an organization like ours to really be collaborative about the impact we have in a city, in a market, in some of our largest commercial spaces, to say, We are bringing philanthropic dollars. We are bringing job opportunities. We are bringing the leadership in terms of pipelining individuals into spaces like ours or other businesses. Certainly from a philanthropic standpoint, we're just here to support the sector, not just ourselves.
Yep.
And also to partner with local municipalities, with public leaders, with other private institutions. That is going to be, that is now, and is the way that this is going to go, I think, for corporate social responsibility, not just at our organization, but at others. And I think we're really proud to play a leadership role in that. Communally, in terms of communication, we're just all aware of more, many of us, and that's going to breed kind of a lot more discussion about what we need to be doing. To another of your points, that even internally, and it takes some effort. We each have our own distinct responsibilities and accountabilities. And if I'm working on Team X and I know that each quarter I need to hit a specific benchmark, and Team Y, that's not necessarily their goal. They have a different benchmark they need to have. We've had to get together and say, we're going to have to reevaluate how we're assessing our success on a quarter to quarter basis. How are we getting together? If innovation is going to become important, if collaboration is going to become important, we're going to have to measure how well we're doing that to say how many dollars are really going into the community, how many jobs are really available there, and how much impact do we have on that? Not just from our own perspective, but how do we pull partners in? That's kind of an overview, but I do feel that this is the way this is going. I feel very much so that this is the way this is going across the entire sector.
Yeah, and I mean, you're clearly in the middle of it and on the cutting edge of it. One of the other themes that jumps out at me, and it's probably obvious to those who've been listening, but I just kind of want to name it, is how much it's what part of being successful in the work you're doing requires lots and lots of partnerships, right? Like you've just got this, it's a web of different nonprofit organizations and youth organizations and educational entities, and in some cases other corporate partners, right, as part of an industry, not just a single business, right? But on one hand, that's great, right? I'm really excited to hear about this web of kind of support and coalition building. But on the other hand, you step back and you go, wait a minute, shouldn't our school, our K-12 and our higher ed system and our employers already have a really neat pathway, right, for people to be, developed in their talent, identified in their talent, and then ultimately placed into an opportunity where they can put that talent to work and earn, a decent living to do it? I mean, the answer is that system is not working in very, robust ways, at least not the way we intended. And what it ends up resulting in is the incredible complexity involved in, all the partnerships that you are building to make these programs really work. So I'm curious, as you kind of segue to your thoughts about education, right, and our talent development pipeline from, say, either high school or from college into the workplace, what can we be doing there to improve? I mean, outside of JP Morgan thinking, you might have examples that are specific things you've been involved in, but how do we improve that? Because if the answer is all this coalition building, company by company or industry by industry, that's a lot of work, right? So great that it's happening, but is that ultimately scalable too?
Yeah, I do think that we need to make some adjustments, but I believe that we're pushing in the right direction. To your point, and this is data that you're well familiar with, the financial value of a high school diploma by itself has decreased over the last 40 years in the 13 to 14% range, something like that, while very specific. People often say graduate degrees, the value has increased, but it's really specific graduate degrees that have increased in terms of their financial value to those who attain them. And that, many of us believe, many people, many folks who've been studying this believe that is directly correlated, that decrease in the value of high school diploma, at least to some degree, to the loss of manufacturing jobs and so there are other impacts in terms of the general kind of work environment and the employment opportunities. And I think that's where we can start to look at the gap, in meaning that if the available jobs, if the necessary skill sets for those jobs have changed, and we know, I mean, it's very difficult, if you start to look at kind of the value of the way the educational system was set up in this country, what it was set up for, the transitions, there are a whole host of movies There's data galore. We have a sense of how that was set up, what the foundation was. But do we know if we've made the adjustment? People talk about adjusting the platform, but have we made the adjustment to the available jobs? There are a lot of nonprofits working on that. There are a lot of organizations building collaboratives, employment collaboratives, but the progress is incremental, to your point. And we're building very massive, intricate, complex kind of systems to address smaller groups of individuals, to try to say, can we take this control of 200? Can we address 1,000 and see if we can move them and give them the skills they need to make this transition and build a better pathway? But I think that what we're looking at is policy, really is a policy issue. And I think that oftentimes it's difficult to address it because it's structural. I personally believe that education looks a lot like infrastructure to most people. When I say infrastructure, I mean people who feel like we need to address our highways, people who feel like we need to address crumbling school buildings, people who feel like we need to address systems, bureaucratic systems that maybe need to be updated, into the digital era. That is overwhelming. It is just, it feels like we have to change the whole world to address that. And I think that addressing education in a larger policy framework really falls into that bucket, that people look at it and think, well, it works well enough for kids to go to school, they learn to read and write, we at least have some sense of whether they know math. But really, that doesn't address, are they prepared for, and again, this is something you can hear in a lot of places, for the job market as it stands. But I believe the disconnect is in terms of making those policy adjustments that will make massive or drastic changes over time. You can't do it in a year. You can't even do it in 2 years. But much like climate change, you've got to start setting 10-year, 15, and potentially 20-year benchmarks to make massive adjustments in the way we're preparing students. And what's funny is I think you're alluding to the fact that as we build intricate kind of systems to address changes, maybe in smaller demographics and specific communities, in some cases we find best practices, and in some cases we actually complicate the conversation by saying, well, could we scale this, even though we haven't thought about whether it's built to be scaled across multiple states, multiple cities, different types of communities.
Right.
Education is very much a local question with regard to, well, how do we address this community and what are this community's needs? And that's why I think it's really a policy question to say, how do you give the tools to those folks leading the effort, whether it be the local school district, the institutions that train teachers, or families, and say, well, this is what the job market is. How do we reverse engineer whether we're going to be prepared for this or not?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many pieces in there to talk about, and I like your point about, we need to think about long-term benchmarks, right? Because these are not easy issues to solve. Progress is not, despite, our best wishes, it's probably not going to happen overnight in really substantial ways, right? But we can chip away at it, right? And over years, you do get to a place where it could be substantially improved. I've always been interested in this, one of the biggest complaints, maybe right alongside the cost of higher education, is the belief among almost everybody that you survey that college graduates, and by the way, the same is said about high school graduates, so it doesn't matter which level you ask about, whether you ask about the work readiness of high school graduates or college graduates, most of us are very negative about the work readiness of graduates, either from our K-12 system or from our higher ed system. And you might say, well, geez, Brandon, you're going to put that on par with the rising cost of college as one of the biggest problems? Absolutely. The reason is because, the top reason that Americans value higher education is to get a good or better job, right? And if we have very little confidence that graduates are being well prepared for that, well, then, that calls into question the return on investment for this whole thing. But here's the interesting point, right? In a lot of that, you start to dig underneath the surface and you say to employers, and these are through qualitative interviews and surveys, okay, what is it about these graduates that makes you feel like they're not ready for work? And there's a mixed bag of things in there, right? Like they don't actually have the skills needed for the job. So that's a misalignment of what they were taught or trained to do, or a signaling problem from employers, right? So there's that. But the most fundamental thing is they say they've never had any work experience, right? Like no evidence of an internship, a co-op, whatever form you want to, an apprenticeship. shadowing, an externship. There's a lot of different derivatives of work integrated learning. But that's what employers want most. And so the irony, though, is that employers complain about it. And then you say, okay, well, what's the fix for that? Well, it's more internships and, a bigger initiative to offer more of those opportunities for younger Americans, and especially because we know there's a big equity, gap related to that for Americans from underserved communities, because they have less social capital and access to opportunities. They might not be able to take an unpaid internship because they can't afford to do it, right? So, so I always find it to be ironic that the biggest complaint from employers about higher ed is something that they can play a bigger role in solving, which is to think about how do we encourage employers to expand dramatically on the internship and other work opportunities that younger people might have. I know you guys are doing a lot of work on that, but if you just take your JP Morgan hat off and say, what do we need to do at a national level to motivate employers to be more involved in this, to make a bigger commitment? Like, do you think there's a federal policy lever that can be pulled to do that? I mean, what would motivate businesses across the country to significantly up their game when it comes to work integrated learning opportunities for young people, or even for folks who are, say mid-career, who are thinking about a total career change? I joke often about the movie The Internship. It's a comedy, but these guys are making a career shift, and they're older. They're not young 18 to 22-year-old college students. Why shouldn't we have internships for people who are making career changes too? There just aren't enough of them. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about what we can do there at a national level.
Yeah, so I appreciate that question, because I do think, along with many others, this is the sort of conversation that we need to be having in order to move this forward. But I don't know that there is a specific federal policy. I think what we can do at the federal level is what we have attempted to do, which is incentivize movement at the state level, particularly around education. It is a state level issue. To really have impact, you have to figure out how to motivate state level leaders, from governors on down, to say, this has got to be a primary part of my platform. I also think that we have done a lot of really great innovation at JP Morgan, and you see it at other organizations too. We have partner organizations in the corporate space who are figuring out how to build strong longitudinal relationships with nonprofits that start to look like this is the future of a potential pipeline. You start to look at a relationship that says, well, what if we did scale this in the city? What if we did scale this in the community? And looking at it from a state perspective, what if we were starting to survey those relationships at the state level? What if at the state level we said, who are some of our largest employers? Who are they creating these partnerships with? Which of these collaborations is maybe more complex than it needs to be? Which of them is just right? And how do we start to look at scaling that and incentivizing organizations? I really think what we need to do is think about not how to create a law that insists or enforces, but how to create incentives, only because I think that's a faster route to making sure that everyone says, okay, there's something in this for me. I'll jump on board and I'll move forward. I said earlier that I think policy is important. I think incentivizing it through policy is critical. I think once we arrive at a place where we have larger scale agreement, I can't help but think about how polarized we are. And a lot of what you and I are talking about falls into some of the polarization. Once the conversation starts, well, who's going to tell me, exactly what goes into the curriculum?
Right.
At the 12 level? Who's going to tell me the value of college, or whether I have to get a college degree, or whether I need to have a certain type of job or work in a certain type of industry? We need to probably stay away from that, but say, how do we incentivize the partnerships that are working and create kind of motivation? And I also think sometimes we miss the potential win in prestige. Sometimes we forget. A lot of people out here, we like to feel like we're doing something that's successful and that we're winning in terms of our goals, and that there's actually a lot to be had, not just with the dollar incentive or with the kind of credit incentive, if you will, towards an organization, but also prestige. States being able to say, here's what we're working on, here's what's working, here are the companies that we're working with that have created this really successful model. And now the next stage is to figure out not how we scale it nationally. I don't, having been in the education reform and advocacy space for a while, everyone is so concerned about going coast to coast when you really need to be concerned with the state that you're in and figuring out how does this work for this state, and then having conversations with folks in another state about what works for you and what their situation is. So I think that you can do that on a private to public level, state to state as well, looking at the major employers,
Yep.
those who influence the workforce and the available jobs in that space, because then they can pull in other large or slightly smaller mid-level employers as well and say, hey, I think this is something that we can work on and we can improve the circumstances in this state, in this city. So I really think it starts at the state level, but at the federal level, you can create incentives that drive that progress.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to think that we start to spend more time at a national and state and local level talking about education, talking about workforce development, talking about labor market policies. I think they're fundamental to some of the challenges that the country's facing. But we just really haven't had a dialogue around those things compared to a lot of the other issues that we're grappling with. And I think the lead is going to come from innovative public-private partnerships, as you pointed out. I'm a big believer that we're not going to solve this problem just from a federal level or just from a state level. We're not going to solve it from just a corporate America perspective, right? Or from the public sector in terms of nonprofit organizations. It's going to be a blend of all of those. And I would love to get to a place someday, because in a lot of ways this is happening, where you kind of can't tell the difference between a company, a nonprofit, or a government entity, because they're involved in work of self-sustainable revenue in some form, right? They're involved in social good in terms of the activities they're supporting, and they're all working with one another in some form where they have codependencies and in very positive ways. So I applaud the work you're doing. I applaud the thinking you're doing. I think you're an incredible role to influence a lot of this, obviously not just for JP Morgan, but more broadly. So thank you again, Fernando, for joining the show. For those who are interested, next week, I'm going to have Ann Kirshner, who's an education visionary, faculty member, an investor in education technology company. She has a fascinating background. We're going to be talking about the horizon of education, looking a few years out. So Fernando, thank you again. Best of luck with all the work you're doing. And I'll look forward to following all the updates and the impact that you're making.
Thanks, Brandon. I really appreciate it.